All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're told that it's time to begin. To make sure that no one went to the wrong room, this is on religion tomorrow. Part of the problem or part of the solution, okay? I'm Guy Strumza from the Hebrew University and the University of Oxford, and I'm chairing the panel. We have four distinguished panelists whom I shall introduce very briefly. The first to speak will be Jonathan Benthall from the UK, who is an honorary research fellow at the Department of Anthropology and University College London, and associate fellow Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. He is the founding editor of Anthropology Today and the former director of the Royal Anthropological Institute. Among his books, Returning to Religion, Why a Secular Age is Haunted by Faith. The second speaker will be Professor Mona Siddiqui, Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies at the University of Edinburgh. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and among her books, Themes in Classical Islamic Law and Theology, which is appearing this year. I've got some early oral detail, just appeared. And she has a number of honorary doctorates, and she is an officer of the Order of the British Empire. The third person to speak will be Professor Mark Silk, who is the director of the Program on Public Values and also Professor of Religion in Public Life and founding director of the Leonard Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion in Public Life at Trinity College, Hartford, Connecticut. Among his many books, Spiritual Politics and One Nation Divisible, How Regional Religious Differences Shape American Politics, together with Andrew Walsh. The fourth and last speaker will be Rabbi Michael Melchior, who was from Israel, who was the former Minister for Social Affairs and World Jewry in the government of Israel, was former Deputy Minister of Education and Culture and of Foreign Affairs. He was a member of the Knesset for many years and is now still today Chief Rabbi of Norway. With no further ado, let me read, since we have to save time, some of us will read their papers, it goes faster. I asked the panelists not to speak for more than 15 minutes in order to keep some time for questions and a general debate at the end. How is religion linked to what can be vaguely called the present predicament of all societies, East and West, North and South? Intuitively, we all know, even from a cursory reading of newspapers, that this is the case. Everywhere, in different ways, religious chauvinism and sometimes religious violence is on the rise, while religious tolerance seems to be on the defensive. Moreover, some of the most serious violent threats to peace within and between societies appear to be directly related to religious attitudes. Since it is obviously the case that religion is part of the problem, it would be foolish to assume that a solution can be found which ignores religion. In his intellectual masterpiece, The Two Sources of Morals and Religion, first published in French in 1932, the French philosopher Henri Bergson spoke of two kinds of religion, open and closed. Similarly, there are two kinds of societies, open and closed, as we have learned from Karl Popper, who may well show here Bergson's influence. In telegraphic style, one could say that open religions are those which are grounded in ethics rather than in ritual, or those in which ethics, and hence the universalizing principle, plays a central role. Open societies are those in which the public sphere is equally open to all citizens, irrespective of gender and sexual orientation, race, religion, etc. A closed religion, like a closed society, will draw a high wall between those within and those without. The sons of light versus the sons of darkness, to use the vocabulary of the Qumran Covenanters. Porosity of the boundaries, one could say, is the major indicative of the level of openness of both religions and societies. The secularization process, which has been going on in Western societies since the 16th century, has limited religion to the private sphere, more or less, while the public sphere has become more and more religion-free, equally open to all citizens. This transformation of religion was very well analyzed by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. We often speak today of a crisis of secularization, or even of a post-secular world, just as we speak of post-modernity. Such an approach does not really offer us the key to a solution. What we must recognize, rather, is that we can observe a new porosity of the boundaries between secular and religious, between sacred and profane. The secular world itself, it turns out, fabricates religion, a fact recently argued by Olivier Roy. And we can now observe a re-entry of the sacred into the secular sphere, but also of the profane into the religious sphere. One should therefore not speak of a return or second coming of religion as if it had ever disappeared, but rather of a deep transformation of its character. Religion is now often endowed with a plural character previously unknown. Globalization is a major component of this transformation, which has a deep impact on a great number of societies throughout the globe, in different ways each time. It thus turns out that we have now a multiplicity of religious possibilities. In short, one could speak of the possibility today of a religion without God, as well as of a religion without ethics. Both cases were unthinkable in traditional monotheistic societies. If I had time, I would argue that we can thus observe under various climates the growth of what I propose to call monotheistic paganism. In antiquity, the main difference perhaps between, on the one hand, Judaism, then Christianity, and later Islam, and on the other hand, traditional pagan religions, may be found in the centrality of ethics in the Abrahamic religions, even more perhaps than in the concept of monotheism. This ethical character distinguishes them from other religions even more clearly than monotheism. Just as we can speak of a pagan monotheism in late antiquity, that of the Neoplatonic philosophers, for instance, we can speak today of monotheisms without an ethical core, as of some kind of neo-paganisms. Such worrisome transformations of religion can be observed under many climates. As a Jew and as an Israeli citizen, I am particularly depressed and shocked by the mutation of Judaism under our very eyes, with what seems to the fast growth of a violent, previously unknown Islamophobia in the name of Judaism, and against which I do not hear protests in the name of, at least, Orthodox Judaism. Is this growth inexorable? Is Judaism under our very eyes undergoing an irresistible paganization of sorts? I certainly hope that elements of an answer will emerge from our panel. Thank you.
Thank you for this much appreciated invitation. To venture prediction about religion in this most sacred city is to risk a thunderbolt. I shall address three themes, however: secularization, New Age spirituality, and toleration. First, secularization. Secularization must be distinguished from secularism, a political program aimed at limiting the role of religions in public life. Secularization describes a sociological process that was taken 4 decades ago to be a straight line whereby religions lose adherents in a world increasingly ruled by technological rationality. A more refined version of secularization theory notices that in the advanced industrial countries, mainstream Christian observance, especially church attendance, has sharply declined. The United States presents an apparent exception. Explanations include the widespread belief in the destiny of the American people, the mutual aid that enables immigrant communities to prosper in cities, and the social services provided by the churches to make up for a defective welfare state. Yet probably the USA is following the same trend as Europe, but with a delay of some decades. In any case, ethnic minorities in the USA, as in Europe, are not following the secularization path, and having in general a rather higher birth rate, they slow down the trend. Moreover, even among the apparently secularized, religion leaves a strong residual legacy. And whereas in the so-called West, younger generations are on the whole progressively more secularized than their elders, this generalization may not hold for the Muslim world at large. So that's clear then, unless we look at the very concept of religion more closely with an anthropological lens. We should ask ourselves what the social study of religion would look like if it had been defined and pioneered not in the West, but in China, for instance, with Confucianism or Taoism, rather than the Abrahamic monotheisms as the baseline for comparison, and without our conventional assumption that religion is a set of institutions and beliefs distinct from other aspects of life. One can think instead of a diffuse religious field that can be identified in every society, including those that are apparently highly secularized, but varying in its strength and its relationship to other fields such as economics and law. If religion is thrown out of the door, it will come back through the window, in a myriad cults and therapeutic systems, but also in political religions such as fascism, and in ideological movements such as environmentalism. To take the example of communism, the personality cult of Mao Zedong, especially during the Cultural Revolution, was, I argue, a religion in the strict sense, whose collapse has left China with a very serious ideological vacuum. Thank you. And I've published a short study of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, considered as a faith-based organization. Next, New Age spirituality. Thank you. A stimulating model for understanding contemporary religion has been offered by the French sociologist Raphaël Liogier in his recently published book, Souci de soi, conscience du monde, translated loosely as self-care, world consciousness, though it doesn't work so well in English. Others have drawn attention to the extent of New Age phenomena. Le narcissisme éclaté, the Californianized eclecticism, whereby talk of the spiritual replaces the religious. Liogier takes the argument further, positing a deep structure of contemporary spirituality. He proposes that the contrast between individualism and the mobilization of a global conscience is unwarranted. What he calls individuo-globalism is the creeping moral orthodoxy in which personal well-being and a care for the whole of the cosmos mutually reinforce each other. Within this overarching structure of sensibility, all manner of specific religious and religioid or para-religious doctrines and practices find their place. Not only Western Buddhism and yoga, but also the new style motivational training programs that have sprung up everywhere, holistic medicine, and the cosmopolitanism of a new elite that the French call bourgeois bohème, whose geographical mobility and creative aspirations make them a kind of new ruling class. The mainstream theologies are affected too. In some liberal Jewish observance today, God has become the ultimate power for good. Anglicans infer that if God is love, as St. John's Gospel says, then the equation can be reversed so that love is God, while within Islam, the Gulen movement and neo-Sufi groups have shifted focus away from Sharia-based orthodoxy. As this spiritual culture gains strength, national boundaries come to seem arbitrary and are surmounted by various new transnational movements, from the evangelical NGO World Vision to Facebook. Traditional religious hierarchies lose credibility, but fight back defensively, forming tight doctrinal lagers, such as we find in ultra-Orthodox Judaism, in Benedict XVI's reassertion of Vatican authority over refractory priests and nuns, and in Salafi Wahhabi interpretations of Islam. Conservative religious groups become smaller in size, resisting the trend towards a loosely freewheeling spirituality, but more rigid. If there's a problem with Liogier's so-called individual globalist model, it is that it risks becoming a catch-all explanation, all new data becoming grist to its mill, rather than a hypothesis open to falsification. But it is underpinned by the findings of the World Values Survey, which documents how post-materialist priorities come to dominate in societies where safety nets and the rule of law liberate citizens from concerns about survival. The Euro-American nations now face huge challenges to their competitiveness and to the welfare state. Maybe economic decline will lead to a proliferation of marginal cults, but also to the scapegoating and stigmatization of minorities that always result from threats to living standards. Globalism could go into reverse. One can detect advanced signs of this in the far-right movements afflicting Europe, and in the maneuver whereby some groups of the former urban working class, victims of economic globalization, adopt the rhetoric of oppressed minorities. National frontiers that were becoming relatively porous are stiffened, limiting the historic role of labor migration in mitigating poverty, whereas the movement of financial capital is hardly restricted. So lastly, my third theme, religious toleration. Racism, that is to say discrimination and oppression based on a social definition of race, is still widespread all over the world. But religious prejudice can be equally strong and is often correlated with racial differences. Anthropologists, as students of physical and cultural difference, can help to oppose racism by showing that it has no scientific justification. What can anthropologists in their capacity as students of religion do to oppose religious prejudice? On the one hand, no doubt, they can show how pronounced differences of religion can be masks for political differences. A classic example of this was the Northern Irish question, where the sectarian division between Catholics and Protestants was overlaid on the division between the earlier occupants of Ireland and settlers from the English and Scottish mainland, who were granted the northern counties with a built-in majority in 1921. The theological differences turned out eventually to be relatively insignificant, and among the drivers for a political settlement was a cooperative campaign by the churches of all denominations to persuade both sides to forswear violence and to put their trust in democracy. But on the other hand, those social scientists who would reduce ethno-religious conflict to a political struggle for land and resources are surely misguided. Religious differences can polarize nationalist sentiment through mutual anathematization and also through encouraging martyrdom. It is worthwhile to examine the theologies of competing religions and prepare a balance sheet of the extent to which they breed exclusiveness as opposed to the humanism which must surely in future be essential for the comity of nations, and which expresses itself in pro-poor humanitarian organizations where the traditional religions find common ground with secular moral values, values that in fact they helped historically to articulate and inspire. To start with Judaism as the matrix of the other two great monotheisms, Leviticus enjoins a morality that should be a model for modern nation states. As Archbishop Rowan Williams put it in a lecture given in Jerusalem in 2004, quote, "This is how a nation is meant to be living by law. This is how a nation is meant to be, living by law, united by a worship that enjoins justice and reverence for all, exercising hospitality, with a special concern for those who've fallen outside the safety of the family unit, the widow and orphan, and those who fall outside the tribal identities of the people, the resident alien, the stranger within the gates, unquote. This morality surely underpins the immense contribution made by Jews to all the humanities. One may speculate how different the world would be today if Judaism had become a religion of conversion, which might have been reconciled with the presuppositions of ancient Hebraic theology, rather than an ethno-religion. The actual historical outcome is that Jewish identity is a tripod with three legs: Jewish peoplehood, the Jewish religion, and the land of Israel, making it unique, since no other ethnic identity makes an analogous claim to three overlapping definitions. As for Christendom, the taste for persecuting heretics and infidels set in early, and in Britain we were burning bishops and witches only a few centuries ago. Though imported from the Middle East, Christianity provided legitimation for the unquestioning supremacism of Europe, while Jews were singled out for special oppression as a near enemy. In retrospect, however, we may trace a slow countercurrent towards universal humanism, provoked by the challenge of our encounters with what we now call indigenous worlds. Two outstanding figures of the 16th century were the missionary Bartolomé de las Casas, who was devoted to trying to secure better conditions for the Amerindians colonized by the Spanish, and the French essayist Michel de Montaigne, who asked in his essay on cannibals whether eating a dead man's flesh was really worse than common European practices of penal torture. We may see Las Casas as prefiguring centuries of colonial paternalism, and Montaigne as prefiguring romantic primitivism. And Christendom also had to go through the Victorian stage of condescending belief in progress. But the modern approach to religion, influenced by anthropology, has now come to influence mainstream Christian theology and missionary practice. Christians today, notably the Roman Catholic Church, often advance the idea that Judaism and Islam, belonging to the family of monotheisms, are closer to Christianity than, for instance, Buddhism. But the structure of monotheistic cousinhood, as one may call it, is less pronounced and historically rooted than in Islam. Classical Islam espoused a specific concentric model of religious toleration, with Islam in the center, then a center of scripturalist faiths, given qualified recognition as dhimmis, people of the book, and an abhorred outer realm of shirk, variously translated as polytheism or paganism, and kufr, infidelity. Those Islamic scholars who still adhere rigorously to this structure of thought find themselves at odds with the principles of freedom of religion and respect for indigenous belief systems, principles that are endorsed by international organizations such as the UN. Yet it can be argued that when we examine the respective histories of Islam and Christendom, the Islamic concentric model used to afford a degree of protection to non-Muslims that the Christian churches withheld from their fellow Abrahamic faiths, thus making possible the persecution of Jews in Europe far more brutal than any discrimination against Jews in the Muslim world. Today it's an open question whether the concentric system, and in particular the rejection of shirk and kufr, polytheism and infidelity, are too profoundly entrenched in Islamic thought to disappear entirely. In favor of this thesis, Islamic civilization, for all its past brilliance, never produced a Las Casas or a Montaigne who were able to imagine themselves in the position of Aboriginal peoples threatened by monotheistic hegemony. And it's hard to imagine today an Islamic counterpart to Claude Lévi-Strauss appreciating the contribution of polytheistic belief systems to our global cultural heritage. But against this thesis, Islam has shown immense flexibility in accommodating and indeed adapting to local belief systems, for instance in India and Africa. Arguably...
Time for the others, please.
Sorry, I think I'm within...
I'm sharing this.
I'm just coming to the end. I'm just coming to my last paragraph. Arguably, it's merely a matter of time before new, less purist interpretations of the foundational Islamic texts become widely accepted. Indonesia, with its famous mixture of religious traditions, provides a laboratory for testing the two theses against each other. I've skated over my three themes, and in conclusion would only suggest that it's part of the genius of great religions to give an impression of immobility while in fact changing rapidly. Those who invoke religion for causes of human engineering always find that it has unintended repercussions. We should guard against accepting a stereotypic view of any religions based on yesterday's knowledge.
Ladies and gentlemen, I was asked to speak on Islam in Europe, but generally about religion and its place in Europe and in the UK. So I will do that, starting with secularism, but ending on a particular issue that I'm involved in, and I think which is an issue of significance, which Jonathan mentioned in passing, which is the issue of religious freedom. The renowned sociologist of religion, Jose Casanova, wrote of a paradox in the discussion of religion in the contemporary world, namely that scholars of religion are questioning the validity of the category of religion at the very same time when the discursive reality of religion is more widespread than ever and has become for the first time global. But the place of religion in public or private life, its place in social, ethical and political discourse, is now hugely contested in Europe. For many people, the individualization of religion, not as a transcendental experience, but as a value-laden normative ethics, has become the most important phenomenon of religion today. With the advances in sciences and medicine, with an increased awareness of world poverty, the issues of socio-economic injustice related with it, the shift in gender roles and expectations, the social and political impact of modern life and globalization, the demise of structured and more formal expressions of religious allegiance, something markedly different is taking place in both the private and the public domain. When whole areas of personal, ethical and political life are being rethought against the background of scripture and tradition, this must be viewed as a radical shift in religious consciousness. This religious consciousness has both a public and a private face to it. The question, however, is what we mean by public and what we mean by private. In assessing the multiple and complex reflections of religion and religious values today, scholars of religion have to address the issue of secularism and secularization, and how these two terms are intertwined with the way we view religion as a public or private phenomenon. In his seminal work, The Secular City, Harvey Cox provides a distinction between secularism as an ideology and secularization as a liberating worldview, a historical process almost certainly irreversible, in which society and culture are delivered from tutelage to religious control and closed metaphysical worldviews. Secularization, like religion, is difficult to define because today the term is used rather loosely and ambiguously in both academic and lay debates. But it points to one key factor, which is that at least in most of the West, religion has lost its public hold. Religion may still have its connective and collective attraction, binding people together, as Charles Taylor states, but society is one in which even faith, for the staunchest believer, is just one possibility amongst others. Today, many understand the religious and the secular as a conversation or clash between two opposing concepts. This is incorrect. Furthermore, religion has no specific legal definition, but its influence and impact in society is often assessed through legal cases. And this has happened for various reasons, but partly because of the frequent media attention given to contesting whether religion is a force for good or bad in the modern world. And here it's specifically theistic faith, seen as something which directs us to an intolerant past, whereas secularism grounds us in individual freedom and orients us towards a hopeful future. The debate has a simple premise, which is that a gradual secularization of most of the Western world has been realized through a conscious and enlightened distance between church and state, especially after the bloody religious wars of early modern Europe, leading eventually to healthy liberal democracies. And the roots of this go back to the Reformation, about which the American sociologist Peter Berger wrote, "Protestantism cut the umbilical cord between heaven and earth." The crux of the debate is not about religion versus the secular and their mutual interdependence, but whether religious expression is undergoing the kind of revival which may threaten or destabilize the relatively calm, well-ordered, public and pluralist spheres of most Western countries. To this debate must be added Europe's own soul-searching of her own cultural and political future. Europe sees her past and future as Christian secular, where the Islamic presence is becoming increasingly problematic. The conflicts of recent years have made this issue even more complex. While I personally would reject the claim that 9/11 brought religion back, what September 11th did do was convince many onlookers that religious expression could quite easily be equated with religious fanaticism, and religious fanaticism could have its root in the interpretation of those very scriptures held sacred by millions. The public-private dichotomy has been exacerbated in recent years with the visibility of minority faiths, bringing into question the very value of diversity. It is this visibility and the right of self-determination which reverberates from the wearing of crucifixes, the headscarf in France, to Turkey's entry into the EU. When it comes to Islam, attitudes to women, penal law, and issues of honor within the framework of an ill-perceived Sharia law are very often the things which seem to define the Islamic presence in Europe. And it is this aspect of religious determinism which many European citizens of all backgrounds find unsettling to their personal, social, and political identity. While most European countries have developed particular models of state-church relations, rarely today in Europe do political leaders take religious organizations as representatives of comprehensive ideological movements. These are viewed almost exclusively as interest groups with a moral agenda, where the religious leaders speak as moral authorities, not leaders of mass movements. And this is where the current conflict with Islam resides, and has been compounded in recent times with big stories which have received global media coverage. A significant example was that of the Danish cartoon crisis in 2005. The 12 cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, published in September 2005 in the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten, resulted in outbreaks of violence by some Muslims and sparked off the deeper debate: can Islam in the Muslim world really understand, accept, and respect the notion of civil, diverse societies, where there are competing moralities, divergent discourses, where in some ways nothing is held sacred anymore and everything is up for critique? Perhaps this is a price for freedom of expression, but the violence within certain Muslim communities confirmed the suspicion many have that Islam could be a complete idiosyncrasy in the West. In October 2006, the then leader of the House of Commons, Jack Straw, created a national furore when he suggested that Muslim women should take off their face veils when they came to his surgery, as it was a sign of separation. While he acknowledged he didn't wish to be prescriptive, that the immediate context of his concern were the Muslim women visiting his surgery, the issue grabbed media headlines for days. The increasing visibility of the hijab and the niqab has been one of the most potent signs of female identity in recent years. Muslim and non-Muslim voices argued for and against veiling, right to self-expression, and some commentators reiterated the ever-popular clash of civilizations theory. But why should a piece of clothing attract such social furore, where all the struggles of human rights, religious expression, and political identity seem to collapse or converge? I think it's mainly because the veil has changed as an iconic image. It no longer conjures up images of the mystery and lure of the East. It has come to represent everything the West has struggled against. For many, the wearing of the niqab and even the hijab may not be unlawful, but form part of an ideology with no place in modern life. Yet curiously, it is this very covering which continues to be contested in a place like Turkey. Issues around the religious freedom of the individual and the rights of society as a whole can be quite heavily contested in the current climate. And in the UK and in Western Europe, one sees two quite distinct trends emerging. One is that in the age of globalization, when all forms of media are weaving together the world into a new social fabric, militant/extremist religious expression is the one force which could tear society and civilizations apart. And the second is the visibility of minority communities in the West, which often assert themselves with a more fundamentalist and rights-based language. This has become particularly, though not exclusively, associated with Islam, in which the most highlighted version appears to many, and is Islam which is intolerant in itself, but which demands tolerance from others. For many Europeans, a tolerant public sphere is itself under threat from a competitive rather than constructive form of religious discourse. But it's not just the visibility of difference, but the implications of this difference which is unsettling. The bombings on London's public transport in July 2005 sparked off the debate that multiculturalism, which is in essence a way of preserving equal citizenship for marginal ethnic groups, had failed. Many felt that British Muslims harboured no loyalty to Britain, and the question now turned to the question of values. Do Muslims hold different values, which will inevitably clash with the values of liberal democracies and civil societies of the West? A fundamental problem with such questions is that they are still generally premised on viewing minority groups as monolithic in their identity and self-expression. Even though many now distinguish between a normative Islam and Islamism, cultural, linguistic, ethnic differences are often overlooked and the individual becomes a collective. Other religions face similar issues, but the Muslim collective is often singled out as more isolationist than other communities and unwilling to buy into a trajectory of liberalism, which demands a level of separation between the spiritual and the temporal. Thus, much of today's debate on religion and secularism in Europe is fundamentally about how to integrate Muslim communities into European societies. While thousands of Muslims do live full integrated lives, their religion is often presented and lived as a definite system of beliefs and non-beliefs, which cannot be submitted to any critical inquiry. The discussions around the failure of multiculturalism in the public sphere have also led to renewed interest in the question of citizenship. On a personal note, I strongly believe that there is a difference between being a citizen and being a good citizen, and actually the state itself may have very little to do with the option I choose. Despite its primacy as a fundamental political structure in society and its vast reach, the state remains limited in scope and operation in regard to the dynamics of social relations. So if I feel myself to be a British citizen, then why do I feel this? We should acknowledge that citizenship is not simply tied to having the protection of the right passport or being able to vote and not breaking the law. Rather, to feel a true citizen, a fundamental requirement is a sense of belonging. In Western Europe generally, cultural and religious diversity pose challenges, but still allow at times that we compare and contrast value systems and different lifestyles, so we can dialogue towards building more universal values. But we'll have to make some choices about what we tolerate and what we keep out. And this is fundamentally a debate about ethics, because I strongly believe even diversity has its limits. For all of us, this means in the end that if we are truly living in the presence of God, we need to have the conviction that our faiths and cultures can have a positive impact and work for the welfare of the wider society, the public good. But we must also have the courage and the humility to speak out against what the theologian calls the malfunctions of faith, how does the expression of my faith create an injustice for someone else? No language is as emotive as religious language. To conclude, we live increasingly in a world of diaspora religious communities in which all religions are everywhere, often governed by largely secular regimes. Can the state protect religious freedom when there are different ways of defining religion, different ways of practicing the same faith, and can lived religion in all its manifestations really always be protected by the law, especially when the state is not allowed to decide on what counts as religion and what does not? The issue of religious freedom, just my last point, religious freedom as a modern problem of liberalism. Perhaps no other freedom today is as contested as religious freedom across cultures, because it's difficult to agree on its moral and social significance in the ever-shifting hierarchy of human needs and rights. At a time when the very place of religion in public life is feverishly debated, religious freedom is increasingly viewed by some as a last hurdle in the fight for human dignity. But religious freedom, unlike many other freedoms, even if it's recognized, is not necessarily valued. Religious faith has the potential to become an emotive issue amongst those even who have secular outlooks. This attitude is not confined to any one religion, but is manifest more in communities which understand religious freedom as a duty to practice only one faith, and for whom diversity and plurality of faiths and outlook poses a challenge to God's will rather than a reflection of God's will. The paradox is that in all the freedoms we talk about today, religious freedom as a given in society may be something unique to liberal democracies alone. So I leave you with a thought. Will this issue be of any meaningful significance in those countries not far from here undergoing their own intellectual and social revolution? It matters because globalization means that what happens in the caves of Yemen, the streets of Jerusalem, the malls of Dubai, resonates in the lives of ordinary people in the largely secular countries of Western Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stevie. Now, Professor Marx will present his reflections on religion in North America.
Thank you, Guy. I suppose I should begin by apologizing for confining my remarks to a single country. North America is too large. But when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold. And so any consideration of whether religion is going to be part of the problem or part of the solution, I'm afraid needs to take note of the role of religion in American politics generally and foreign policy in particular. As has been true in many places around the globe, that role has expanded to a remarkable extent over the past several decades. To be sure, religion has always been a factor in American electoral politics. We're coming up to an election, so I can't help thinking about it today. With partisan voting blocs often constituted by religious or ethno-religious identity, the Catholic vote, Democratic, the Jewish vote, Democratic, the Mormon vote, Republican, the white Protestant vote, Republican, outside the South, until recently, and so on. It may fairly be said that the rise of the religious right in the 1970s was the result of a concerted effort by conservative pastors and Republican Party operatives to move white Southerners from their traditional allegiance to the Democratic Party, traditional since the Civil War, into the Republican fold, an effort made possible by the National Democratic embrace of civil rights after World War II. The effort, of course, succeeded so well that Southern evangelical Protestants now constitute the base of the Republican Party. But what is new in American politics over the past couple of decades is the creation of a partisan divide according to degree of religious commitment, regardless of religious affiliation. That is to say, the more religious you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. The less religious, the more likely to vote Democratic. This divide has come to be called the God gap, though it could just as well be called the godless gap. On the one side, 60% of those Americans who say they attend worship services at least once a week vote Republican. On the other, 3/4 of those who say they have no religion vote Democratic. The latter group, by the way, has more than doubled in size over the past 2 decades, such that it now represents over 15% of the American adult population. Perhaps not very large by European standards, but we consider that quite a change. Along with African Americans, who are religiously a special case, by the way, these constitute the base of the Democratic Party. The God and godless gaps have given current American politics something of the feel of European politics in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with a secular left opposing a religious right across a broad cultural divide. In struggles ranging from abortion rights and gay rights to evolution, that is Darwinian evolution, and climate change, we also consider ourselves engaged in a culture war. And while the battle lines shift back and forth on particular issues, currently abortion rights seem to be losing a bit of ground, same-sex marriage winning, the fundamental divide is, I would say, growing stronger rather than weaker. Today, for example, that is the 21st of June, marks the beginning of something called the Fortnight for Freedom, a 2-week propaganda exercise announced by the American Catholic bishops because, in their view, religious liberty is under attack in America by the government. Their principal concerns, that is the bishops, is to protest a requirement under our new health care law, which may be our unconstitutional health care law shortly, but be that as it may. The bishops wanted to get their oar in the water before anything like that happened. Their belief that the new health care law requiring insurers to provide coverage for contraceptive services to women free of charge, that's an imposition on their religious freedom and to be fought tooth and nail. And that's the front line of the American culture war at the very moment we exist now. Now, there's a case to be made that religiously informed domestic politics have provided a useful mechanism, and do provide a useful mechanism, for socially conservative citizens to push back against changes in norms and mores that they oppose. And whatever one feels about such new norms and mores, a healthy society should provide citizens with means of expressing themselves through collective action. In the international arena, however, I'm not so sure the effects have that much going for them. Since the attacks of September 11th, 2001, the simplicity of a domestic war of religion against secularism, or vice versa, has been complicated by the conviction among conservative evangelicals in particular that America is also embroiled in an old-fashioned war of religion, one of Christians, or perhaps Judeo-Christians, against Muslims, or perhaps Islamists. Thanks to the determined efforts of the Bush administration, 9/11 and the consequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were cast as a war against terror rather than Islam, although there's evidence that President Bush himself saw the contest in literally apocalyptic terms, Christian apocalyptic, that is. Anti-Islamism, however, has gained political legitimacy since the beginning of the Obama administration, most notably during the 2010 midterm elections, when Republican candidates were able to make successful wedge issues out of mosque building in various communities, including New York City, and an alleged threat of, quote-unquote, Sharia law to American jurisprudence. Creating a consistent religious ideology out of twin wars against secularists and Islamists has not been easy. But during the present presidential cycle, Newt Gingrich gave it the old college try. In January of this year, for example, he said, and I quote, "From my perspective, you don't have an issue of religious tolerance. You have an elite which favors radical Islam over Christianity and Judaism. You have constant pressure by secular judges and religious bigots to drive Christianity out of public life and to establish a secular state except when it comes to radical Islam." I couldn't make this up. If nothing else, this provides a certain window into the worldview of the party that could well control both houses of Congress and the presidency come next January. Now, here in Israel, the importance of the evangelical right in America has been recognized for longer than it's been recognized in America itself. That is, ever since Prime Minister Begin invited the Reverend Jerry Falwell to come to Israel in 1978. 35 years later, we have graduated to Pastor John Hagee's Christians United for Israel. In the U.S., the culture war has effectively theologized America's support for the Jewish state. Theologizing the Arab-Israeli conflict is, at least in my view, part of the problem, not part of the solution. Of course, the problem, however we decide to define it, is hardly confined to Israel-Palestine, I would say. However, that here too, in the larger world, the culture war has pushed American foreign policy in some problematic directions. And I'll just cite one small case in point, and that is the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, which began as a plan to embarrass the Clinton administration and which over the years has given the world some reason to think that when it comes to religious liberty away from home, the U.S. is principally interested in making the world safe for Christian missionaries. Again, this does not seem to me to be part of the solution. To be sure, activist religion in America is not all about politics. On the international front, many faith-based NGOs, such as Catholic Relief Services and World Vision, mentioned before, must be placed, at least mostly, on the positive side of the ledger. While recognizing that such aid may come with religious strings attached, there's no doubt that when it comes to acute and chronic needs of populations around the world, solutions would be a lot harder to come by without the religious impulse to heal the world. And that's a widespread impulse. Let me then conclude by noting, perhaps by way of some explanation here, that over the past 2 decades, Americans have increasingly come to see religion as a chosen rather than an ascribed identity. And by that I mean their own religious identity. This is survey data, quite interesting, which shows, seems to show that really when people are asked, what is your religion, if any, they're less inclined to say what they were born as, and more inclined to say simply what their current practice and identification is. This is an interesting development with large consequences for particular religious traditions, but overall, it has had a tendency to polarize the religious landscape because the people in the middle who cared moderately or little at all, but nonetheless identified with a particular religious community by reason of ascription, seem to drop out of the equation, and you have people moving towards the ends of the spectrum. And this, of course, has tended to heighten the anxiety of religious leaders and institutions who can themselves no longer count so readily on their flocks staying and reproducing in place, as it were. I would propose, perhaps too boldly, that this trend towards religious identity as choice is a worldwide phenomenon, in a way connected to what Guy was talking about at the beginning, a phenomenon that has contributed significantly towards making religion the dynamic force it is today, for good and for ill. If I'm right, it suggests that if religion is not part of the problem, it will be part of the solution, but also that if it is not part of the solution, it will be part of the problem.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all those who have stayed till this late hour. I have put my manuscript aside, and I have heard here 3 very, very interesting and very learned lectures of analysis, of which I agree with nearly everything. I will talk to you from my heart, as we say, both Jews and Muslims, that what comes out from the heart goes into the heart, with the hope that it will go into the heart. And I'm not speaking as an expert and not as an intellectual, but as somebody who's fighting for an agenda. And I'm fighting for an agenda of turning religion into part of the solution. If it is or not, we will have to hear learned papers about maybe in 5 years and 10 years, if we've succeeded or not. But I think that we can all agree, and we've also heard that religion is on the stage, on the world stage, and I'm speaking mostly from the Middle East, but for sure true from all the areas which we've heard about. Religion is back. It's always been there. If we talk about the Middle East conflict, no doubt, from the outset of the conflict, the Middle East, even the secularists, even Zionism, secular Zionism, which was secularists, the claim to the land, which was brought forth from secularists who didn't believe in God, but believed that God promised us the land, and used the motivation and the writings, and I can give you many quotations, we don't have time for it. There was in this city, I remember a couple of years ago, a big graffiti saying, "Nietzsche is dead," signed by God. This is part of the return of religion to history, to our history. On the Jewish side, look at the numbers in the state of Israel. It doesn't matter if we like it or not, how we analyze it. Look at the number of kids in religious schools in Israel. I'm talking about on the Jewish side. Look how many there were 25 years ago in the schools in Israel. We're talking about, let's say in the ultra-Orthodox schools, not more than 5 to 6% in first and second grades. Today we're talking about at least 25% of the Jewish children. More than 50% of all the kids are going to totally religious schools today, of which a vast majority are ultra-Orthodox schools. That's the situation. On the Muslim side, everybody knows what the facts are, what is happening in the countries around us, what's happening in Israel. That's the fact. Religion is back. Religion is the biggest NGO in the world. Doesn't matter if we like it or not, that's another question. What religion can be a potential to be a tree of life, and as the Talmud says, religion can be a drug for death. Religion can be everything. Depends what we do, how we serve God or we serve ourselves. Depends. Depends, as we heard also from Professor Monas Siddiqui, it depends what we do. How we do. If we serve ourselves, we serve God. If we have humility or we have hatred, depends what we do with it. So I think the future of the world is very much dependent on this, and the future of the Middle East, very much so, and we don't have time. We live in biblical times. Things happen so fast, with such a speed today. I think, and I want to say this in this room, in this conference, under the auspices of our President Shimon Peres, who has led the peace, I think, and I've said this consistently for the last 25 years, there's been a major mistake in the peace processes. They have been totally secularized. There's been a willingness from the beginning to exclude religion from peace, the peace process, believing that religion can only lead to mischief. And I can't blame the people who have believed that, because religion has led to a lot of mischief. The problem is that the excluding of religion has led to even more mischief, because ignoring religion has not led to religion disappearing, but it's led to the extremist factors to blow up. It's not gone away, it's blown up in our faces again and again and again. The assassination of Rabin, on our side, the Yigal Amir, Baruch Goldstein, parts of the philosophies of the settler movements, the philosophies of totalitarianism inside Judaism, the hatreds, the philosophies of not renting out apartments to the other, to Arabs. Yesterday, the desecration of mosques, the racism of inside Judaism. And on the Islamic side, I don't have to prove it. I think everybody probably here knows it too well. Knows it too well and knows only that side of Islam. Now, my claim, which I need to prove, yet to prove, but I feel very strongly, is that there is another side. There is another side which is very strong inside Judaism, which is very strong inside Islam, and which needs to be cultivated and strengthened. And I think that is our hope for building a new Middle East, which will truly be a new Middle East, not going down another blind alley and hearing another time that Tony Blair hopefully will try again to bring another meeting together with Abbas and Bibi Netanyahu, which will fail, and another photo up in Sharm el-Sheikh. But building something real will be a peace which might sound to you to be something messianic, but a peace between Islam and Judaism, a true peace, and I'm telling you it's possible, between Islam and Judaism, even radical Islam and Judaism, which will really bring a true change, which will make it possible to have a political peace between Israelis and Palestinians. V'lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in heaven, it's possible to do it. Nobody has tried, seriously. And I think that the change in the Arab world can be a challenge for us to use the elements which exist, not in the thinking of the Western world, which is the Protestant thinking of a total division between religion and state, which will not work, but a dialectic religious thinking, which will use the elements, the religious elements, which is not just one claim of land and holy land and Dar el-Islam and Waqf and Eretz Yisrael HaShleima, but there are other elements in religion. Peace is also an element of religion. Human dignity and human life is an element of religion. And there are inside, I don't want to go through all the religious theories of this, but there are inside the Jewish religion and Islamic thinking and Christian religion, but just here now, the problems are not the Christians. There's one place in the world where that's not the problem. Just now, there are thinkings, nobody has used them, nobody has challenged it. And there are aspects now, both in Tunis and in Egypt and in Jordan and in the Gulf states and other places, and in Israel, also amongst the more radical elements, also in Judaism. Not all of them in Egypt also, but if challenged in the right way, I believe that we can create, and there are people who are trying to do it also in this hour, we can create a paradigm shift, which will change, really change everything. Creating a religious peace which will give a justification, a religious justification. Shouldn't have religious thinkers and religious leaders to substitute the political leaders. That's not their role. Although the political leaders are not that great. The religious leaders are also not that great. And it's possible. The good news, it's possible, it's just that nobody's tried. And I've sat with the more radical leaders, probably the only Israeli, including the more radical leaders of the people who are now coming in power in North Africa, and more radical leaders amongst the Palestinians. And you would be surprised if you heard which people. And sitting with them and confronting in a dialectic religious thinking suddenly there's no limit to which solutions we can find. And I believe that that will affect, if we can make peace in Jerusalem, believe me, it will affect Paris and London, even Jyllandsposten. You have to have the newspaper, you have to know how to say it in Danish. It's the only criticism I have of Jylland. I don't want, it's okay. But the Danish journalists also have to have sensitivity. Not only do they have to learn in the Arab world, but the Danish, they also have to. When they had the same discussion in the editorial board of Jyllandsposten, if to do the same thing about Jesus, they decided not to do it. They also have to have sensitivity. At the same time that they have to learn not to start killings in the Arab world because of what's printed. But the same kind of sensitivity we need to have for each other. And the French have to learn that the Republican dogmatism is also not the solution. Because there has to be a new debate in a new Europe. You didn't finish that debate 200 years ago. And we need to start that kind of dialectic debate, all of us, and have to be open to that debate between religion and secularism, and between the religions. We need it inside Israel, we need it with each other, and maybe something very inspiring can come in that exciting new world which will be created. Maybe something romantic can come out of that. I believe in it. Really, I believe it with my heart, because I've sat with jihadists who have never ever been confronted with a new thinking. And after hours and hours of debate, suddenly a new world has opened. And they've become part of a coalition for peace, for salam, not even for hudna, for salam, for something deeper. And it's possible to turn it around if we just believe that it's possible in our new world. So I want to challenge, don't just analyze if we're in an Arab spring or summer, or if we're in a Siberian winter. But let's take responsibility for building a future together. We don't have time, but religion can be a slippery slope to hell, yes, but it can also be a gate to heaven if we just want it and do something about it. And that, I think, is to be an obedient servant of God. We're all temporary residents here. And let's make something of this world which has been given to us. In Rio, they're sitting in these days to see if they can protect the world and create for future generations that also their religion will have a role. A religion has a role to build the future for our generations. Let's not blow it up, but build together with the different religions. In the seam between the religions, we can sanctify God's name. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Melchior. I'm very glad to hear this applause. Rabbi Melchior's words reminded me, I had an impression of déjà vu, or rather déjà lu. And in the 16th century, Guillaume Postel, who was a Jesuit and the first professor of Hebrew at the Collège de France, writes that the only way to make peace upon earth will be to have a meeting in Jerusalem of wise men from among the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians, and they will sign a peace which will be based on serious grounds and will last forever. Amen. Now, we still have 23 minutes for an exchange with the audience. I'm supposed to take questions. The problem is that with these lights I don't see you, so let me try to move here. Is there a question? Everything was very clear. Yes, please. Could you stand up and take the mic?
There's a microphone here.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask Rav Melchior to say a little bit, as it were, in specifics about some of the things that have been happening and that you think should happen.
Will you answer as sharply and briefly as was asked?
Well, it's like saying the whole of the wisdom standing on one leg. I think that we need to open ourselves, and I can't, what I can say what I'm trying to do here in the Middle East. I'm not talking about meetings of leaders with funny hats and nice cloaks and photo opportunities. I'm talking about in-depth dialogues with the true people who have the influences in the communities. Not with chief rabbis and, although I'm not talking about specific chief rabbis, there's some good and there's some bad. But I'm talking about the real people who have the influences in the communities, the Islamists, the religious influence, people have on the Jewish side, they can be settler rabbis. I'm talking about people who have the influences, to bring them together, to see, can we really feel, I'm talking about the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, in Tunis, in Morocco, in Jordan, in Syria. Can we find the right language to bring us down from the totalitarian heavens with a dialectic language which is inside all our religions? Can we find that language which will make it possible for a different kind of peace, which will be a peace with the peoples, not with some dictators, which was the peace of the 80s and 90s, which I wasn't against. I remember the discussions with people like my good friend Yossi Beilin and so on, said, let's make a quick fix peace and then we'll deal with all the in-depth issues. And I wanted to give it an attempt. I'm for it. I was for Oslo, I was for Annapolis, I was for Taba, I was for everything. But it didn't work. Why are we going down again and again the same blind alleys? I will be for going down. But it just, what is the result? Nobody believes in this anymore. And everybody's despairing. People are willing to do what's necessary for peace. But nobody believes in it. So we need a paradigm shift. And we need a real peace between the peoples. We'll have to do something serious for this. But I think that if people in Israel believed that we could have peace with Islam, wouldn't that be something great to come to the people of Israel? Wouldn't we then be willing to do something serious? Now, and it's possible, that's the good news. But we need to do something proactive for this. If Islam, the people in the Arab world are sure that Israel is here in order to wipe out Islam, we think that's ridiculous, but that's what the Arabs believe. Now we need to do something proactive. We're just going down this line, which is bringing more and more hatred towards Jews and Judaism, more and more hatred towards Islam. We have Jews who support hatred against Islam, who support parties, racist parties. Could you believe that? We have Jews who sign declarations and rabbis who support. We have Poles in this country that you support, that you can't rent out apartments to Arabs, to Muslims, that you can't give jobs to Arabs. Would you believe that in the States of Israel? Is that what we've learned from Jewish history? And we need to fight this with all our power. And this is an active work, and we need to grow up, and we need to raise to the situation and fight this in our midst. Everyone needs, otherwise this is not a battle. This is not a battle of civilizations. This is a battle inside, which every civilization needs to take seriously. Otherwise we'll wipe out ourselves. Listen, and I'll say a last sentence here. It's not what Judaism is about. I think Professor Bental said, it's not what Judaism is about. It's not quoting what Judaism is about, what Islam is about, what Christianity is about. It's not interesting what Judaism is about. It's what we do with what it's about. That's what's interesting. It's what we are. It's what we do with it. It's not writing a paper about what Judaism is. It's not going to Rio and says, what is Judaism about? It's what we do with it. It's what we actively do today. And you know, in the book Kuzari, the king asks the Jew, it's very nice that you have all kinds of nice philosophies. What happens the day when you get political power? What are you going to do then? And he doesn't have he doesn't have an answer. This is our challenge today. I hope that we come well out of that challenge. It's in our hands, like in everybody else's hands, Christians. And what do you do with it? Not what a nice conference, and you say nice things about every religion is for peace, and then we go home and kill each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Both Professor Silk and Professor Siddiqui want to say something.
Just one quick word. I don't want to get in the way of the dialogues with the Muslims, but if you could spare a few moments during the intermissions to talk to our evangelical Christians about signing them up for it, I think it would be a good thing.
Thank you. Just on the back of what you were saying, I think that in some ways you were talking about the religious language that started the conflict, or it was at the beginning of the conflict, but it was a nationalist language that slowly gained momentum with religious language. And I think that that's what we have to be very careful about when we ask people to act and think and dialogue in the name of faith, that no language is as motive as religious language. So when certain aspects of nationalism aren't working, people resort to religious language to mobilize the masses, if I can put it like that. And I think, with all respect, I do think it matters. Absolutely, what the individual does matters. But I do think it matters when people say and are willing, just like you are, to commit themselves in public in highly vulnerable, fragile, contested spaces to a specific position. You may think you've been doing this all your life, but I'm sure there are people who are listening to you who, when we hear you, it sounds like common sense, but a lot of people will be thinking, I never thought of it like that. So I don't think it is all about platitudes. It might sound like it after you've done it 20, 30 years, but the very reason why people are going towards more conservative, radical, fundamentalist, defensive positions in Christianity, Judaism and Islam are precisely because they haven't been tempted by the more humanistic, liberal, embracing outlook. And that, I think, is a real worrying. Why aren't they being lured into that?
Absolutely right. What we thought were platitudes, even 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 years ago, are not platitudes anymore, because there is a vacuum and the extremists are going into that vacuum. I hope in a month or 2 we will be up with, I hope, an immense website where all the central leaders of Judaism and Islam will be speaking on this website. I hope it will reach millions and millions of people in Arabic and Hebrew and English, saying things which I thought you didn't need to say, but all those things are not platitudes. You're absolutely right, are not platitudes anymore. The evangelists, some of them at least, beyond my, you know, there are things which are beyond me. Other people have to, I've tried many, many, many times, as, you know, they pick out what they want of my words and they print it again and again. It's a difficult case. And they're used, absolutely right, they're used here by the extremists. They condition their support for organizations and the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars they pump into the extreme right here on the hatred of Islam, and there are people here who build themselves on this hatred, and they love it here because they pay their way. By the way, don't think the same people here who take the money, they say when we've finished with Islam, we're going to take on the evangelists afterwards. Just as the evangelists say, when we're finished with the Islam, we'll take on the Jews afterwards.
Let me say something from my own experience on a bit more optimistic tendency. I teach at Oxford in a new chair which was established 3 years ago, and I was the first professor to be appointed, and it's called the Professorship for the Study of the Abrahamic Religions. It was donated anonymously, but eventually I met the gentleman who gave the money, and he's a Saudi citizen from Jeddah. And when he was told by the University of Oxford that they had appointed an Israeli to be the first professor in his chair, he reacted, he said, well, what a wonderful idea. And when I met him for a tea party at my college in Oxford a few months later, at some point he asked me, and tell me, Professor, how do you intend to fight Islamophobia in Europe? I had not been prepared for this question, I must say, and I realized that the idea was to show the Christians, the Europeans, and of course for somebody from Jeddah, Oxford is the hub of the universe, to show that Muslims belong into the family. And Muslims in Europe and elsewhere belong into the family, and the concept of the Abrahamic religions actually, which is a very new concept, didn't exist before the 1970s, is something created by European Christians, or I think some of them Lebanese Christians who were students of Massignon, to show that actually we belong, it's not only the Judeo-Christian tradition, but the Muslims are also part of the same tradition. They use a concept that comes from the Quran, actually can be found before, but comes from the Quran, sons of Abraham, the religion of Abraham, but in the Quran, it is of course in the singular. Abraham had only one religion, and we, the Jews / the Christians / the Muslims, we are the only true inheritors of the religion of Abraham. Speaking in the plural puts them on the same level. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The idea is not new. The idea existed until the Enlightenment. Think of Nathan the Wise of Lessing. The three rings are indistinguishable. Only one may be the true ring, but you cannot see the difference. This was lost in the 19th century with the nationalist movements in Europe, with Romanticism, and with racism, which developed later on, and which put the Jews back together with the Muslims to a despicable Orient. This is starting to change. And Rabbi Melchior, may I suggest something? I'm very moved by your plea, and I certainly would countersign it completely. The fact that Christianity doesn't count so much here in the Middle East, I think is a very sad fact. The fact that Christian communities throughout the Middle East, from Iraq to Egypt, including the Palestinian territories and including Israel, are living, is a very sad fact. And I think that we should not, it would be better if we did not forget the Christians, and in a sense, they have, certainly in Europe and in North America, Christianity has succeeded to manage religion together with the public sphere where everybody, including non-believers in Christianity, are equal, even in officially Christian countries like the UK. And I think this is, the Jews too in Europe were able to participate to the Enlightenment and the Haskalah, but at the time they didn't have a country. And we in the Jewish country don't know how to integrate non-Jews.
Don't misunderstand. First of all, in all the processes which I participate in, the Christian communities are full participants What I said was that the Christians at this stage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are not the problem. That's what I said. They're not the problem. There's one place where the Christians are not the problem, that's all. Nothing else.
We still have some time for questions. Yes, please, could you come to the... And could you try to be sharp and precise and short?
I will only say that I work with interfaith dialogue for the last 30 years, and it is really the only way to get into peace. We visit mosque, we have mosque in our Muslim in our synagogue, and we all work together. And when somebody in speeches ask about politics, our Muslim friends say we will not speak about politics, we will not mix things up. Peace is peace religion. We are all brothers and we all believe in one God. What is my concern is that in religions nowadays all the extremists do appear. This is the problem now. Religion is the solution for peace. But when you have only radicals that appear, that will not go into dialogue.
Thank you very much. I take it that was not a question. The lady over there, please, yes?
Like a shout, or can everyone hear? Okay, fine.
They need to hear you, the translation.
Even Albert Einstein in 1929 said that the only solution to the Jewish-Arab problem is to leave out politicians and to get wise people on both sides to talk. Now, for many, many years, there are so many interfaith dialogues going on, Rabbi. The point is, how do we get all these people of goodwill, like yourself, to impact on the politicians? I was writing for a South African paper, and I gave your point of view now, and the person didn't want to publish the article because he said, all of this is going nowhere. It is only politicians that can make the decision. So my question to the panel is, how can these wise men actually impact on the political scene? Yes, a step of the internet is one way, but is there no other way they can impact and make the difference in real political terms?
Thank you. I think that since we have very little time, we'll take some more questions so that people can express their views, and we'll try to finish.
I just want to ask Michael Melchior, so trying to understand you. Are we talking about the new religion?
Can you...
Are we talking about a new religion? I mean, combining three different kind of...
No, I don't think anyone...
No, I just want to understand.
More questions?
Mine is similar to the previous question about the impact that religious leaders can have on politicians and social change. In America, I believe evangelical Christians have largely taken the wrong side of social issues. So not only how can they affect politicians and social change, but how can religious leaders specifically make sure that Judaism and Islam is on the right side of a progress towards peace and the right side of social change in Israel and Palestine?
Thank you very much. I'll take two more questions. Yes, first. Very briefly, please.
To what extent do you believe that the exclusivity exhibited, particularly in the extremism of all three major religions, will impede the mutual understanding of them?
Rabbi, you were asked to stand on one leg earlier. Can you stand on no legs? What would you, what can religious leaders offer on practical questions such as refugees, settlements, borders, that politicians can't?
Thank you. I think that we should try to sum up. Jonathan, would you want to try?
Thank you. Well, by contrast with my paper, which was trying to give a few insights from anthropology into wider questions, I do fully agree with Rabbi Melchior about the need for practical action. You were skeptical about the caliber of some religious leadership, and by implication, when you talked about people in fancy clothes and photo ops, you weren't that impressed by some of the interfaith dialogue, which I personally think a lot of it is rather up in the clouds. I think one should start with very practical things, as I think you were suggesting. And if I could just mention something I'm involved with myself, it is Islamic charities, because the humanitarian field is one where all the religions have a great deal in common. And very sadly, in this part of the world, Islamic charities have come under a great cloud, in fact in the world at large, for historical reasons. I'm involved with a Swiss government-sponsored project which is trying to help those Islamic charities that are bona fide and which face unjustified obstacles, to show that they are acting in accordance with international norms of charity, such as non-discrimination, accountability, transparency, etc. And this, I think, it's just one small field, but it's a start, and it's a very practical start. And finally, Islamic Relief in the UK has become a very large and successful worldwide aid agency, working with CAFO, that is the Catholic agency in many parts of the world, fully accepted by Oxfam and other major aid agencies as part of the community of major aid agencies. And this just shows what, with a sympathetic government and our charity commission, can be done. And humanitarianism is a field in which even secular people who honor the religious tradition, their religious traditions, can participate.
I got a lot of questions here. I would like to, we don't have that much time, but first of all, those who, I don't know what your editor thinks that the politicians here have done such a good job. What I've suggested hasn't been tried. So I'm not talking about some dialogue meeting here or there. I'm talking about a total different approach. Hasn't been tried. So I don't know what your editor has dismissed, because I don't know what you've written. We haven't tried this yet. I'm talking about a total different religious approach. And if you think that religion up till now hasn't played a role, it has played a role. Played a very negative role. But there have also been, if we talk about Israel, I just mentioned one of, the late Yitzhak Rabin said he would never have signed the Oslo Accords without the support of a religious leader like Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. That was very important. And I can give you many other examples of that. I can also give you negative examples of things which are going on these days. Just look at the negotiations which are going on now about the 5 buildings in Bet El or something like that. These are with religious leaders. They're sitting with the rabbi in Bet El and negotiating how to move these 5 buildings or not. Don't tell me that religion isn't playing a major role this way and that way, and religious leaders on this side. Don't tell me that in the Tahrir Square, religion isn't playing a role. And it's not only the Muslim Brotherhood. People in the Western world are looking only at the religious party. When it was prayer time in Tahrir Square, everybody was praying. Maybe few not. But practically the whole, everybody was praying. We never understood. We never understood Yasser Arafat and his religious connection. We never understood which circumstances he grew up in. We have never understood it in the Israeli leadership. We've never understood the impact of religion, not on this side or not on that side of the conflict. And I'm just going to conclude it. And also when it comes to other issues, specific issues, before Barak went to Camp David, I was then a minister in his cabinet, and I went to him, I urged him that many of the issues which would come up at Camp David, he could go with an agreement, a religious agreement. He didn't want to. He said, religion will only mess up things which I will fix at Camp David. What did he do? He went to Camp David and took all the religious issues and messed them up. Not alone, right? Not alone. There were people who helped him to mess up at Camp David. But these are complex issues. I hope you will be able to write a good article for your newspaper, and we'll talk about that.
Just 2 very brief points. The sociologist Max Weber once said that Islam doesn't have a sense of tragedy. That's what makes it distinct from Judaism and Christianity. And a leading 19th century missionary also said, Islam doesn't have a sense of sacrifice. And I think perhaps that's one of the things that we do need in our personal lives, as well as our political lives, a commitment to some sacrifice. How we make that sacrifice is up to us. And the only other thing I would say about dialogue, it's a hugely contested term. But the only difference is that dialogue for most of us coming from peaceful societies like North America or Europe is a luxury. It's not a matter of life or death. But dialogue in conflict-ridden areas, and I would say that the Middle East is a conflict-ridden area, is a matter of life and death, or can be a matter of life and death. So perhaps the question isn't what is dialogue in itself achieving, but what would the society be like if there were simply no dialogue at all?
Extremely short, but it does seem to me so much of the discussion at this conference has been about the Arab awakening. Rabbi Melchior talks about the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. I don't think religion it's going to be possible to take it off the table, and so the question is not whether it's on the table, but how it's on the table. We do have certainly plenty of evidence in this country and in the United States of interest group religious politics. The challenge is to create a different kind of religious politics, and that, I take it, is what you're suggesting, and I hope we can all support.
Thank you very much. We spent 3 minutes more than our time. We didn't solve the problem. Had we had 10 more minutes, we probably would have, but that's life. Thank you very much.